Dr. Roberts, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Absolutely. Thank you for the introduction, Kevin. I just want to make sure everybody can hear me. Is that true? Okay, cool. It's great to see you guys, and I'm excited to present this research. As Kevin mentioned, my co-author and I both have PhDs in economics. Our advisor in economics always used to tell us that the coolest research papers and the best economics you can do is in a Principles of Microeconomics textbook, and that's what we really did. We apply some complicated statistics when we do this at the academic level. But one thing that was cool for me, there was a learning process for me, is that when we look at the theory, we find like price gouging laws, like under any reasonable assumptions, should lead to these shortages in the search that we observe. And so it really hit me once we look at the data. We're like, yeah, we find that price gouging leads to shortages in search. And it's like, wow, cool, surprising finding. But no, it's not actually surprising at all, because that's exactly what economic theory tells us should happen. And that was like a cool thing for me to think about. And so that's one reason today that I'm not going to show you a bunch of really complicated statistics. I'm going to show you some basic charts on the evidence side of what we found, but I'm going to really focus on the economic theory side. As Kevin told you, I'm an assistant professor of economics at Weber State University in Ogden, Utah. My co-author Rick Chakraborty is at Christopher Newport University in Virginia. I'm going to share my screen. I encourage you to ask me clarifying questions throughout the presentation, because I think we'll have plenty of time for those. And just general discussion. If you guys want to talk about anything that I'm sharing as I'm going through the presentation, feel free to throw it in the chat. I'll obviously be presenting, and you guys know I might lose focus and not notice those. So I think Kevin's going to help me out a little bit on that. But absolutely feel free, because I'd love to have a discussion about these issues, because I think this is some really interesting and important stuff that we've discovered here. So I assume you can now see a PowerPoint presentation that's not in slideshow. Is that true? And then I'll go here. And can you guys see just the main page, the main PowerPoint slide? Does that look good? Okay, great. So the title of my talk today is Price Gouging Regulation and Consumer Behavior During COVID-19. And my co-author Rick and I have actually done 3 papers related to this. I'm going to talk about all 3 because they're very related. And I'm just going to jump right into it, since we already sort of did the introductions. And before we get into the main part of the presentation, I want to make sure we're all on board with what we mean when we talk about price gouging. And I think this, just talking about this part of it, brings up a lot of important stuff that you will see as you become an economist, is that we kind of want to separate human emotion and human rationality and the tools of economics, because those things oftentimes kind of collide with each other. And when we think and talk about price gouging, at least for me, I mean, for me to this day, the image that pops into my mind when I think about price gouging is the person that is forward looking, drives around, buys all the hand sanitizer and all the Clorox wipes and all the toilet paper in town, puts them in their storage unit, and then goes online and says, hey, I'll sell you all this stuff, but it's $50 per roll of toilet paper or something like that. That's sort of the imagery that we create in our minds, or at least the imagery I create in my mind when I think about price gouging. And if you go and just Google price gouging and hit images, for example, these are the types of images that you'll see in that search. But now let's think about, like, definitionally, what is price gouging? Definitionally, what price gouging is it's higher prices during a public emergency. So that's a much more broad thing than this more specific case of somebody hoarding goods and then marking them up a ton. And so examples of that, the kind of quintessential example of that before COVID was gasoline prices after hurricanes. Because everybody's trying to leave New Orleans, so everybody's getting gas. They're also often carrying a lot of heavy goods with them. And then that leads to a massive demand increase for gas. And gas stations realize this and say, hey, we can make a lot of money off gas at this time. And that's that price gouging behavior. So that used to be the quintessential example. A newer example that I imagine all of you guys probably heard about in March or April of 2020 was toilet paper during a pandemic. That one was really strange, and I think it'll be fun to talk about that today because there's not as clear of a connection between toilet paper pandemic as gasoline hurricane. Hand sanitizer and pandemic makes a lot more sense. Toilet paper and pandemic is kind of an interesting case, and I think that's one of the interesting things to think about is it's not clear in advance what goods an emergency will increase demand for or affect the supply and demand of. Now, most US states define price gouging as a 10 to 30% price increase relative to pre-emergency prices. So these are the states that have actually defined what they mean when they say price gouging, because if you're going to have a regulation like that, you should have parameters. Like, what do you mean is price gouging? Now, a lot of states don't even have parameters and just say things like large price increases. Now, that's problematic from a regulatory standpoint for a variety of reasons, but also from an economic standpoint too. But what I want you to see here is that those states that do have limits tend to have them between 10% and 30%. Now let's just compare and contrast in our minds these two versions of what price gouging is. The one that pops into our mind when we hear about price gouging in the news is hoarding, extreme price increases, greedy individuals. When I look at the definition of what price gouging is, I see that a toilet paper roll going from $1 to $1.30 is price gouging, even if that's happening during a pandemic. Now, for me, that allows me to think more clearly about the policies that I'm thinking about, because this $1 to $1.30 toilet paper is affecting a lot more people than those small number of cases where somebody goes and buys all of the hand sanitizer, toilet paper, and Clorox in town. Thinking through this a little bit on these anecdotes of people hoarding. The biggest number that I could find is a person in Tennessee purchased 17,000 bottles of hand sanitizer. And we hear that and we think, wow, that is an insane amount of hand sanitizer. That person is causing this shortage. But if we take a step back and think, well, there's about 7 million people in Tennessee, and there's probably more hand sanitizer bottles than people, that is nothing. 17,000 bottles of hand sanitizer is nothing compared to the market for hand sanitizer in Tennessee. So one person buying 17,000 bottles isn't that big of an impact, although it's crazy anecdotally. What would be a huge impact, though, is if all 7 million people who normally buy 1 bottle of hand sanitizer decide to buy 2 bottles of hand sanitizer. If I look at any of those individuals, I say that behavior isn't extreme at all. But if I look at the total impact, then that's 14 million bottles of hand sanitizer. And so these are the issues, just we have to step back as economists and think about what's actually happening on the ground and try to remove ourselves from more of the emotional arguments that may be made when we're thinking about something like price gouging. Because even the language that we use, price gouging, is designed for that very purpose. Because what it is it's higher prices during a public emergency. So I just wanted to get out of the way, what are we talking about when we're talking about price gouging? Now I'll just quickly go over the agenda for the rest of the presentation. So I'm first going to tell you about the economic theory of price gouging regulation. And that's basically going to be a theory of price ceilings, which I've heard some of you are familiar with through experience with microeconomics. Price gouging will be a specific example of that situation. And so the economic theory is relatively straightforward. Binding price gouging regulation, which I'll get into the details of what exactly that means in a little bit, leads to shortages. Definitionally, in economics, if the price gouging regulation binds, meaning that it actually changes people's behavior, it will lead to shortages. Now, this is very important because some people think that COVID led to shortages. COVID led to scarcity. Quote, COVID made certain goods more scarce. Scarcity is the whole reason that we have economic thinking at all. That's what COVID did. COVID did not cause shortages because shortages are caused when you don't allow the price system to work. So that's a very important distinction that we want to make as economists. Now, once these shortages occur, they led to consumer search. Because if somebody can't find toilet paper at their grocery store and they don't have any toilet paper at home, there's a really good chance they're going to keep looking for toilet paper. Shortages in search are costly, particularly costly during a public emergency, because we want to be trying to solve the emergency. We don't really want to get in the way of the economic process during a public emergency. In fact, that might be the worst time to stop the price system from working. And so just thinking about this story in pictures, is I'm going to show you this map in more detail later, but basically we have a wave of price gouging regulation hitting the United States with the onset of the COVID pandemic. This wave of price gouging regulation leads to shortages that are well known at this point because they were widely reported in the news. And then that leads to consumer search. Now, consumer search is costly even if it's not in pandemic. This is a picture of consumer search during the pandemic. And I want you to think for a second about what this picture is showing and why consumer search might be especially damaging during a pandemic. These people are lined up together outside of a grocery store during a pandemic, and that's going to be an important story later on in this presentation. So shortages and search are costly during a hurricane, during an earthquake, and during a pandemic. There's some special reasons to believe that shortages and search are really bad during a pandemic of an infectious disease. And so we'll talk about that in a little bit too. Now, after I go over the economic theory of price gouging regulation, I'm going to provide some evidence of these consequences that theory tells us will be caused by price gouging. But again, that evidence is not surprising, as I mentioned before, once we see that, like, yeah, this economic theory makes sense, and this is exactly what we should observe in this situation. And what the evidence of those consequences is are more online searches for goods that were known to be in high demand during the pandemic, more physical searches for those goods. We're going to find that actually had deadly consequences during the pandemic. And then we also found some evidence of consumer adaptation during the pandemic, which I think is really interesting to think about really from an economic science point of view. So just a little bit of background information on price gouging regulations and where they came from. So historically, they've been enacted and revised in response to increased prices for certain goods during emergencies. So basically what you have is you have stories about gas stations or hotel owners dramatically increasing prices just before, during, or just after a hurricane. And then those anecdotal stories make people angry because they're angry at that type of behavior during those emergencies. Politicians react to those emotions and by passing price gouging regulation. So that's kind of tends to be the general story of what's occurred in the past. Now, the stated goal of price gouging regulation varies, but kind of has this general flavor throughout, and that is to ensure the availability of goods at fair prices. That is the stated goal. When I talk about the goals of politicians, I usually like to call them stated goals because it's not obvious what the actual goal is, but definitely what the stated goal is to ensure availability of goods at fair prices. New price gouging regulations were enacted during the pandemic. Now, the reason this happened is if you think about it, well, Louisiana has had price gouging regulation for a long time. It was the first state to enact price gouging regulation. Why? Because it experiences a lot of public emergencies. A lot of the states that enacted price gouging regulation for the first time during COVID-19 happen to be the states that have not experienced a lot of public emergencies in the past. And we'll see that from that map that I showed you a bit, but I'll show you in more detail later. Governor Newsom of California, describing the reasons for price regulation, said it was to thwart the pandemic's shameless profiteers and to ensure that all consumers will be able to purchase what they need at a fair price. So again, just sort of repeating this goal of ensuring availability of goods at fair prices. So I thought it'd be fun to just bask in the too good to be true political statement for a second. But then our inevitable return to the dismal reality of the economic theory of price gouging regulation. Because we know, like, of course, like, if you can just make a law that ensures broad availability of good at fair prices, why did you wait? Like, why are we waiting until February 2021 for this amazing law? Like, if we can pass laws that ensures broad availability of good at fair prices, that's kind of like saying, I'm going to pass a law that says there's no more scarcity. If you can do it, pass that law now. And then we don't even have to do economics anymore, actually. But that's what that says. And we need to be very careful about that as economists. That is our job, to be skeptical of such a statement and rigorously apply economic theory to such a claim. And that's what we'll be doing over the next few slides. So I'm going to give you a summary of the theory, but I'm going to show you some demand and supply analysis. So the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic increased demand for and possibly decreased supply of certain products. So just thinking about the demand side, two ways to think about what that means. Thinking about hand sanitizer. After the onset of the pandemic, an individual or individuals were willing to pay higher prices for the same amount of hand sanitizer. Meaning, hey, I'm going to the store to buy hand sanitizer and I noticed the price went up a lot. Well, I'm actually okay with that because right now, today, because of a pandemic, I'm willing to pay a higher price for the same amount of hand sanitizer. Another way to think about the same thing is I walk into the grocery store and the price of hand sanitizer has not risen. Well, my demand for hand sanitizer has, so I will purchase more hand sanitizer than I would have before the pandemic, holding the price constant. Those are just two ways of saying the same thing, and we'll look at that on a demand curve together in a second. Now, the onset of the pandemic simultaneously activates price gouging regulation. Because the way price gouging regulation works is that it is not activated until the onset of an emergency declaration, usually by a state's governor. So these two things are happening at the same time. People want more hand sanitizer and toilet paper, and at the same time, we're getting price gouging regulation. Now, if we combine these things together, so if these shifts are large enough, then price gouging regulation will be like a binding price ceiling. And as economists know, binding price ceilings lead to shortages. And so that's a summary of what the theory looks like. Let's actually look at some supply and demand analysis to think about how this is going to work out. So here I've just drawn the beginning of the toilet paper market. I was going to do the Nebraska toilet paper market, but then I looked at my map and realized Nebraska does not have a price gouging regulation, so it didn't work, and then I had to delete that. So good for you guys for not having a price gouging regulation. Now, usually in the classroom, we just draw this straight blue usually. Do you use blue, Kevin? I feel like it's a tradition to use blue for demand and red for supply. Sweet. Usually we just draw the straight line, but I've had a lot of fun over the last year thinking about exactly what the demand curve for toilet paper looks like. And this is the best thing I've come up with yet. So just think about what we do with toilet paper, not too hard, but just think about toilet paper. And so we know this steep portion of the demand curve says at a really high price, I won't buy that much toilet paper. As the price decreases, I will buy more toilet paper. And if the price goes really low, I'll buy a lot of toilet paper, a downward sloping demand curve. That's all that says. Now, why did I make a steep section and sort of a shallow section? And that's just kind of my opinion, thinking way too much about what the demand curve for toilet paper might look like. But I think this actually makes sense. If you think about what you use toilet paper for, the most important thing you use toilet paper for, you're going to be willing to keep buying toilet paper for that purpose. You're not going to decrease your use of that much, even if the price rises quite a bit, because that's sort of like the need part of it. But way over here, when I've got a ton of toilet paper quantity, sometimes I blow my nose with toilet paper. Sometimes I clean up little messes around the sink with toilet paper. Sometimes I have a bonfire pit in my backyard. Sometimes I use toilet paper to start the fire, but you shouldn't use the kind that has like the lotion in it for that, because sometimes it's not flammable. And so if you thought you weren't going to learn anything today, you've learned at least one thing probably. But this is like this is the toilet paper I don't really need. I'm going to buy a ton of that though if it's crazy cheap. This is the, hey, it's kind of hard for me to decrease my toilet paper consumption, much less than over here. This is like the, I don't want to be using less toilet paper at this point. Another way to think about this, actually, let's slow down. I'm getting too excited about my toilet paper demand. So what I want you, the takeaway is that demand curves are downward sloping. It doesn't really matter so much what exactly the toilet paper demand curve looks like, but I think it probably does look something like that. Now, to find market equilibrium, we also have to introduce supply to our toilet paper market. And so just to be really clear, the blue demand curve represents the idea that people buy less stuff when the price is high, and they buy more stuff when the price is low. The specific shape isn't that important, but I think it could, in this specific situation, I think it can actually tell us a lot. Now, the supply curve is the other half of the market. Those are the producers of toilet paper and the retailers. They will be willing to sell more toilet paper or supply more toilet paper to the market when the price is high. And they will supply less toilet paper to the market when the price is low. So the supply curve is upward sloping. And so this is just reflecting incentives in the economy. I will supply more stuff if you pay me more for it. Over here, less if you pay me less. And then the opposite on the consumption side, right? Buy less of expensive goods, buy more of cheaper goods. Now, when we bring supply and demand together, we find economic equilibrium where quantity and price are where supply and demand meet. And economic forces bring us to this equilibrium point. Because if we were at any other price, economic actors would either bid the price down because we would have a surplus, or sorry, a shortage of toilet paper, or sorry, a surplus of toilet paper at the top. Because if I tried to set a price too high, then I would have this much supply, but only this much demand, right? And then I'd have too much. What happens when we have too much stuff? Prices decrease. Similarly, if I had too low of a price, I don't have enough supply for my demand. I'd have scarcity or a shortage, and prices would be bid up towards equilibrium. So I just want to stop real quick. Are there any questions about demand, supply, or equilibrium in general? I know that maybe you've seen this before, but I just want to make sure because it's important that we kind of understand where economic equilibrium comes from at this point. Okay, so you guys good? Okay, so now the pandemic comes. And demand shifts for toilet paper. And so now, as I mentioned on the last slide, so I mentioned you could hold the quantity constant, and this person would pay a higher price for the same quantity. That's reflected by looking up. They would pay a higher price for the same quantity. Or if the price remained the same, they'd buy way more quantity at the same price. Those would both be consistent with this demand shift. However, we move actually to a new market equilibrium if we have a free market operating, where we have a higher quantity of toilet paper, but also a higher price of toilet paper to reflect this increase to demand. So this is how we would have expected things to play out in Nebraska, because there's no price gouging regulation, is that the new demand for toilet paper is reflected in higher prices and higher quantities. So now let's introduce regulation to this market. And so what regulation does, it says, hey, you're not allowed to increase the price above this line. Notice that even right there, I only talked about one side of the market, and that's what we always do with price gouging regulation. We say suppliers are not allowed to increase the price. But note that price gouging regulation also stops consumers from bidding up the price. We usually don't think about that side of the market. Price gouging regulation stops the supplier from charging a higher price, but it also basically stops the consumer from bidding up the price. And so we're not allowed to go all the way to P2, the higher price. We're stuck at the price ceiling that's caused by price gouging regulation. And now this introduces a shortage, because at the price gouging price ceiling, this is how much toilet paper suppliers will supply at that price. However, this is how much toilet paper consumers will demand at that price. So consumers will demand more toilet paper than suppliers will supply at a binding price ceiling, and that introduces a shortage of this size to the market. And so that's the theory of how price gouging can lead to shortages. Are there any questions about that part of the theory? Now, one response to this that I've heard, and one thing that was being said during this time period, specifically by toilet paper suppliers, was that price gouging is having no effect because we would never increase toilet paper production in this small of a period anyway. So you're actually wrong. Price gouging has no effect because we wouldn't have increased the quantity supplied anyway. Well, what they're saying is that the market for toilet paper actually looks like this in the short run. They're saying that the supply curve for toilet paper is perfectly inelastic in the short run. In other words, no matter how high the price goes, I will not supply more toilet paper to the market. Now, that's kind of weird because a lot of the language we hear from the pro-price gouging regulation side is like, we have to stop the greedy profiteers. So it's kind of hard to believe that that's consistent with not increasing production of goods when their price goes way up. But let's just say, yeah, that's true. It's impossible to increase toilet paper production. Well, then the shortage is even bigger, right? Because now I get no action. And now I really want those consumers to think about their actions when they're buying all that extra toilet paper. The way that the economy gets them to think about that is it charges them a much higher price. Hey, toilet paper is really scarce right now. I want you to think about your toilet paper behavior. What the regulated price does is say, no, don't worry about it. Buy as much toilet paper as you want because it's cheap. And so this regulation is not allowing this signal to be sent to consumers, even if you can't increase toilet paper supply in the short run. And in fact, in that case, the shortage will be even bigger. Now, finally, I wanted to show that the same would be true if we had a supply shift. If something happened to supply chains that made it difficult to deliver toilet paper to the market or hand sanitizer, we still would want the price to increase to reflect this scarcity. And if we didn't let the price increase to reflect that scarcity, we would get a shortage. So regardless of where the shift comes from, demand or supply, we still get a shortage by having price gouging regulation. Now, my co-author and I did try to use some statistics and look at some different evidence to decide whether we thought this was coming from the demand side or the supply side. And the way we did that is we said, well, supply chain breakdown is going to kind of affect a more broad category of goods, where a demand shift is going to be more specific. So what we did is we kind of applied our analysis to goods that we thought would be affected by supply versus demand. And what we found is that our results are really consistent with demand shifts and not breakdowns in supply chains. So that was kind of an interesting side result that we found. But before I move on, this is really the rigorous economic theory of what price gouging regulation does. And it's really just an application of price ceilings. Are there any questions about why we would expect this to cause shortages in the economy? Okay, cool. So I'm going to move on in that case. And so just to summarize again what we've done, and this is the same summary I showed you before, except with one additional insight at the end here. So again, the onset of the pandemic increased demand for certain products, toilet paper, hand sanitizer, among others. The onset of the pandemic also activated price gouging regulation. If those shifts were big enough, then price gouging regulation acts as a binding price ceiling. So those are the same things I told you before. And then we just looked at that using supply and demand analysis. Now, the thing I didn't mention before is now that these shortages are there, these lead to consumer search. That's the next part of the theory. And you could even think about like demand for search. Where does the demand to search for goods come from? Well, it comes from a couple of places. One place that it comes from would just be shortages of household necessities. For example, if you have no toilet paper at home, you go to the grocery store and there's no toilet paper, that alone will incentivize search because you probably really want toilet paper at that moment. Some people for sure will continue to search for toilet paper. Now that is a first order effect. Like people will probably go search for toilet paper, and we know that that was happening just from anecdotal evidence during the pandemic. Now, maybe a second order effect that I think is important to think about is that another thing that leads consumers to search for stuff is good deals. That's like the American way, is to search for good deals. Well, want to know what one thing that causes good deals are? A regulation that says that you can't raise the price of certain goods. So actually we have this second order incentive. Like I'm going to search because I need toilet paper. I'm also going to search because toilet paper is cheaper than it should be right now. And so you actually have this compounding effect of like, yeah, go for it, search, because if you do find it, it's going to be cheap. Another thing that happens is that suppose you now are at grocery store number 8 and you finally found toilet paper. And you're like, whoa, this toilet paper has an entire aisle, or this grocery store has an entire aisle of toilet paper. Are you going to buy the same quantity of toilet paper that you were going to buy at grocery store number 1 when you're in grocery store number 8? Are you going to think, maybe I should buy all of the toilet paper in this aisle? And then you have become the boy. Then you're that person that we were all looking for. And now it's a little bit more difficult to blame that person. It's like, hey, maybe this is the 8th grocery store that person's been to. Like, I'm not surprised anymore that they're buying all that toilet paper. And so we have to be really careful about who we get angry at when we give people the incentive to do exactly the thing that we're getting angry about. And so, of course, price gouging regulation again subsidizes this decision to buy the aisle's worth of toilet paper. Because why is that toilet paper not crazy expensive? Why has that not grocer not said, I'm the only person with toilet paper, I'm gonna charge $5 a roll? Well, because it's illegal to do that is why they're not doing it. And so now that consumer is gonna go ahead and buy more toilet paper than they would have. And now think back about that the one person 17,000 example versus the 7 million people, one additional package of toilet paper example. Even if everybody's really nice and is like, I'm just gonna buy one extra because I don't wanna be that guy. Well, one extra times 7 million, that's what your shortage is coming from, not from the one person that goes crazy. And I think that's a really important to keep in mind as we're thinking about those issues. So COVID-19, so now I'm gonna move on, by the way, to evidence of unintended consequences. So we know the theory. And as I mentioned at the beginning, what I'm gonna show you now should not be that surprising because it's actually, if you think about that theory, it's pretty difficult not to believe that that's actually what we would see go down if we played this out. And that's what we do find. So COVID-19 again led to a price gouging regulation, what I'm gonna call a natural experiment. And Kevin mentioned that a lot of you are gonna start working on some research. And I think our thinking through this process could be helpful in that light, because we're trying to look for generally natural experiments in economics is what we would really like to get our hands on. And that really drove a lot of what Rick and I did here is just the existence of this special natural experiment that happened. And so the onset of the pandemic led to this surge in demand for certain goods. Toilet paper was a big one, but paper products in general were pretty big. So you can see that this person has some paper towels too. And then it looks like they have some wipes maybe, but lots of toilet paper. Toilet paper is the big one. And so that's your surge in demand. At the same time, again, we're gonna have this wave of price gouging regulation. So the onset of the pandemic led to activation of price gouging regulations via emergency declarations. So states that have price gouging regulation on the books, generally the way it works is that if the governor declares an emergency, that's when price gouging regulation is activated. So it's during emergency situations that we turn on regulation. And so some states turned that on, and we're going to call those the treatment group because we treated them kind of with the drug that is price gouging regulation. And then other states did not activate price gouging regulation. So we did not treat them. And now we have a trial, just like maybe a drug company would do, is I'm going to give some people the cholesterol drug. I'm going to give some people a sugar pill that's like the cholesterol drug. And then I'm going to compare cholesterol after the fact. Now, that's going to be in an extremely controlled environment that we cannot recreate with public policy. But really, the goal of this type of analysis is to get as close to that controlled environment as is possible. That's where it gets really technical on the statistics and econometric side, and that's not what I'm going to go to in the details of. But I would be happy to talk to any of you individually or as a group about those types of issues later on too. And then I just wanted to show you this map a little bit closely because I imagine it's pretty difficult to see on your screen. I should thank Rick for making this beautiful map. And so what we have here are 3 types of states. We have no law states in white. So there you are in Nebraska, you do not have price gouging regulation. And similarly to your north and to your west, and then Nevada and Arizona also do not have price gouging regulation. And then New Hampshire over here is our sole northeast state. Now, I also mentioned that some states had pre-existing laws and some states had new laws during the pandemic. And now those states are highlighted too. The dark ones are those states that had some type of price gouging regulation before the pandemic. And then the gray states are those that passed it during the pandemic. for the first time. And then on the bottom of this map, you can see a timeline with the dates. And these are the dates that the emergency declarations that activated price gouging regulation took effect. So this is our natural experiment being set up. And so are there any questions about how this is going down right now, just in terms of this natural experiment idea? Okay. Oops. And so now, so the two things are happening. We have the demand surges, and now we have the price gouging regulation. So now think back to those supply and demand analyses, right? We had the demand shift, and then we introduced price gouging regulation. That leads to shortages. Shortages themselves are extremely difficult to observe. But the next step was to say, well, if there's a shortage, then we should have more search for those products. And so here again, this is really, I haven't broken it down by types of state yet, but I just wanted to show you because the two goods that we decided to go with were hand sanitizer and toilet paper as a first pass, just because we knew for sure that demand increased for those particular products quite a bit at the beginning of the pandemic. There's other reasons that we picked those that we can go into a little bit and maybe in the questions at the end. But those are the two that I'm going to focus on for now. And basically, because it's well known that demand surged for those. Now, this graph shows how that's reflected in our data of choice, which is Google shopping trends. And so basically, this is a data set that Google has come up with where they use an algorithm that determines somebody's actually shopping when they're searching for goods. So it's not just like everybody typing toilet paper. Google is using an algorithm to identify people who are actually shopping, like searching to actually buy, as opposed to general searching. And so this graph shows what's happening during the pandemic is that we get a massive increase in searches for these products, and this is nationwide. And then also along this, you have important dates. So Washington was the first state to declare a public emergency related to COVID, and that happened on February 29th here. You can see that right before that date, it is when we're starting to see surges and searches. The World Health Organization declared a global pandemic on 3/11. Whoever was searching for hand sanitizer and toilet paper decided the pandemic was global apparently before that date because they were ahead of the WHO on their searches. And then we have a big chunk of states declaring emergencies in mid-March. Alaska introduced price gouging regulation very late in the process, and we actually take them out of our sample for that reason. And for some others, like they're isolated and have different markets probably than the rest of the United States. But this is just showing how Google shopping trends reflect this surge in demand for toilet paper and hand sanitizer nationwide. But now what I can do when I want to actually analyze the effect of price gouging regulation is I want to look at these things separately by state. And so what we can see here is that demand searches surged in all states, including Nebraska, for toilet paper and hand sanitizer. Because even in Nebraska, people wanted to buy more hand sanitizer. That's reflecting, so really our green line here, which is our no price gouging regulation line, reflects the demand increase and how that led to surge, but without the shortage from price gouging regulation. But then if I compare that searches over time in no law states, the green line, to states that introduced surprise price gouging regulation and states that already had price gouging regulation, I see that searches over time are much higher in those other states. And a couple things I want to say here is you might think, well, New York has a price gouging regulation and Nebraska doesn't. And I would definitely expect searches for hand sanitizer to be higher in New York than Nebraska. only because of population. Well, Google Trends is really nice because it's internally consistent and controls for everything like that. So all of these are within state comparisons. So the Google Shopping trend scale is actually relative like to the biggest search day ever. So if I'm looking at an individual state and I observe a 100, that 100 means that state had more hand sanitizer searches on that day than in any other day in its Google Shopping trend history. And so that's how Google Shopping trends work. And it's a nice variable for that because it implicitly controls for things like population and other things like pre-existing demand even for toilet paper and hand sanitizer. And so this is evidence that the theory that we thought would be correct anyway turns out to be true for hand sanitizer. The same graph for toilet paper shows that a similar thing happened. It surged later. Searches for toilet paper surged later, and I think that makes sense because thinking about why it surged, it makes sense. Like, I'm gonna go buy more hand sanitizer because it's a pandemic and I wanna wash the germs on myself. Toilet paper didn't really surge until people like knew that other people were buying toilet paper, and it led to this like snowballing buying toilet paper effect. And that was kind of a different situation. But I think that's reflected for in this later and more sudden surge. Is like, why is everybody buying toilet paper? I should be buying toilet paper too. Go now, is what I think that kind of uptick reflects. Now, one thing that we did more recently, after we got some feedback about our paper, is somebody mentioned, well, it would be a really strong case if you could find a good that was not subject to price gouging regulation, because price gouging regulations do target certain goods. And so if you were able to find a good that wasn't affected by price gouging regulation, did have a demand surge during the pandemic, and you did not find differences, then that would be good evidence that some other thing is not causing what you're observing. And so this is the same chart, but for web cameras. Price gouging regulations do not impact web cameras. And so what we see in this graph is that there is not, although demand surges for web cameras as if everybody goes to work from home, we do not have a divergence in search trends for web cameras across our regulation types. And that makes sense because web cameras are not affected by price gouging regulation. And so that person that gave us feedback, I thought that was an ingenious idea. So thank you to that anonymous person. But this is sort of like, you might think of this as a placebo test. Like why, like this is showing that it didn't affect the good that it shouldn't have affected, because that good is not limited by price gouging regulation. Okay, so I'm going to just talk briefly about the other two main results that we've found since then, and then we'll be getting pretty close to the end. So another thing that price gouging, we just saw that it increased online searches for hand sanitizer and toilet paper, but it also increased physical searches for goods. So what we did is we collected cell phone data, and that was we were able to track the social contacts that people had in retail spaces. So there's data that exists now that literally can see people walking around, and when two people come close together, it's clear that their cell phones were close together, namely closer than 6 feet together, which is possibly a distance that you've heard about a lot recently. And so that might reflect, if I observe more of those social contacts in retail spaces, in places with price gouging regulation, that would be consistent with people searching more in retail spaces. And so we do in fact find more searches in retail spaces for product using this cell phone data. And so the unit of measurement is kind of complicated. And the easiest way to express it is that social contacts were one standard deviation higher in states with price gouging regulation relative to those without price gouging regulation. Also, the data set divided people by income quartile. And interestingly, the most well-off people did not observe as big of an increase in search. They searched more, but not as much more as relatively poor people. Why might that be? Well, because more well-off people probably have ways to avoid search, particularly during a pandemic, that are accessible to them that may not be accessible to people of lower incomes. We think that's what's driving that result. So this increase in social contacts in retail spaces, we predict that increase. And then we're actually able to use that increase in social contacts as an independent variable to see, hey, did this increase in social contacts increase COVID cases and increase COVID deaths? Yes, it did. And that's exactly what we should expect. That's the whole reason that we're engaging in social distancing, is to avoid the spread of COVID. But if I pass a policy that leads people to search more in retail environments, then I will also observe a decrease in social distancing, a decrease in COVID mitigation, and an increase in cases and deaths. And so we did another sort of placebo test. Another anonymous genius told us about this one too. And so this one was to say, well, how do you know this isn't being impacted by some other thing? Well, I wouldn't expect an increase in searches in not retail places from price gouging regulation, right? Like the reason people are searching more is to find the shortage goods. So I wouldn't expect an increase in social contacts in other places. If I found that, then that would say, hey, something else might be driving your result other than price gouging regulation. So we do that, and we no longer find an increase in social contacts when we focus on non-retail spaces. So we only find it in the places that we would expect people to be searching for scarce goods. Finally, the last thing we do is we try to use this idea where we had pre-existing price gouging laws and new surprise ones. Well, if you think about it, people who have lived in Louisiana for a long time have actually had experience and possibly learned from the effects of price gouging regulation. And so what we want to do is let's compare people in surprise law states to one in pre-existing law states to see if we have different impacts that might be explained by learning. Now, this is a little bit tricky because we think that learning could actually lead to opposite effects. Hoarding actually could smooth your consumption of toilet paper or hand sanitizer over in time that made the shortage less bad at any particular point. Kind of like saving and then smoothing consumption over time. However, hoarding could also lead to an information cascade. There's a lot of psychological literature about this around the pandemic. Like, why were people buying so much toilet paper? Well, one reason that psychologists think is, and economists call these information cascades, is, I just saw a bunch of people buying tons of toilet paper. Maybe they know something that I don't know, and I should buy more toilet paper too. And so that would be what we call an information cascade in economics. It's like, I don't really know why I'm going to buy extra toilet paper, but I notice that everybody else is, which means that maybe is a good idea to buy extra toilet paper. And so just quick concluding remarks, because I want to at least, sorry, I've gone a little bit longer than I thought. So economic theory makes clear that price gouging regulation leads to shortages if they lead to binding price ceilings. People will invest in searching for goods, especially necessities like toilet paper. In light of the above, our statistical results, I don't think are really that surprising. And the more that I go over this, the more I'm like, yeah, the theory makes sense. And it would be really actually shocking, I think, if it wasn't reflected in the statistical analysis. And so then maybe to have discussion, what problem does price gouging regulation seek to solve? Well, they want to ensure broad availability of good. The stated goal is to ensure broad availability of goods at fair prices. I think that we can be pretty sure that that is not really what they're achieving in this case. And we probably could think of other policies that were much better fit for that particular end. All right, so that's all I have. I'm sorry I brought us all the way to the end, especially if anybody has any questions. But I will stop sharing my screen now.
So yeah, if anyone has any questions, and also if anybody has to leave at the 5 o'clock mark, you can do that as well. But if you want to stick around, are you okay with sticking around for a few questions, Dr. Roberts?
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
Feel free to unmute yourself and ask some clarifying questions or ask some devil's advocate type situation, whatever you're interested in. One thing I would like to kind of think about is price gouging. Does it have to be a price increase, or can it be prices staying the same as there's a decrease in cost? And I saw this on Facebook the other day as an energy economist who was looking at the price of gasoline, and because crude oil, I guess, dropped dramatically, and then it's like point out where the price gouging is happening.
Oh yeah, I saw
And
the same post. We have the same trend on Facebook.
yeah, I guess so. Yeah. So did we see that at all with outside of gasoline with COVID-19? And do people throw a fit about that? And why are they not throwing a fit about that? Maybe that answers the question of like why we have price gouging laws at all.
I think that's a really good point. And so I think that this is a totally just an opinion, but I don't think that consumers would throw as big of a fit. But I think that we've created a little bit of a situation when we think about political incentives. Like attorneys general kind of pick and choose the specific price gouging cases that they will prosecute.
Okay.
And it's pretty clear. Like, have you guys ever seen the thing where when like the DEA, if the DEA busts somebody with a ton of like weed in a U-Haul, they'll like do the photo op? I promise you that if the DA busts somebody with 17,000 bottles of hand sanitizer, they're going to do the photo op.
Right.
Like, so there's definitely political incentives because that's what it is. It's like, because it's that emotional, that's what they're using, right? They're like, this is an emotional thing that people get mad about.
Right.
And so I'm going to use that. And there's definitely interesting political incentives in play. So I think that outside of the attorney general, was that in Idaho? I think the state was Idaho where this gasoline thing happened.
Yeah.
Probably people wouldn't even have really noticed, but then the attorney general made sure people noticed in a sense. And then I bet you started to get the outrage on that end of it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I used to be an energy economist, and like so many things could be driving that have nothing to do with the pandemic. Like I think what's probably driving it is hedging.
Yeah.
Like those gas stations bought their gas earlier.
Yeah.
And then so they just couldn't, like they bought it before the pandemic, so their cost was higher.
Right.
And so that weird stuff like that. I also noticed that they had higher relative gas prices, but less volatile gas prices.
Right.
I mean, if we wouldn't really wanted to push the emotional side of price gouging, I mean, we could say volatility is, people hate price volatility too. Yeah. So let's tamp that down. But all of those are examples of stopping the price system from working. And I looked for Hayek had a great quote about, I'm not going to say the quote directly because I couldn't find it, but he had a quote about really the importance of the price system is when economics are changing quickly. If you're going to mess with the price system, do it when nothing's changing.
Right.
and then it's fine. Like we're already in this like super stable equilibrium. Like in an emergency is a really bad time to be like, stop the price system from working.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's good. Here in Nebraska, we were talking in the chat that I guess what's weird is I didn't hear much about price gouging here in Nebraska because it seems like there isn't any price gouging law. But 2 years ago, we had a state of emergency. There was floods and the whole 9 yards. And then the College World Series is here every June. And Uber drivers were not about to come out and drive when we have a humongous influx of people for the College World Series. And Ricketts had to lift the ban on these price controls. So I'm guessing that might have just stayed that way because we did get into a state of emergency in March of 2020 as a result of COVID-19. So I would have thought that these laws would have been implemented, but I guess I didn't research it too deeply just now, but I guess that didn't happen. But we still seem to have, I don't know, we still seem to have like shortages, right? So even without the price gouging laws, we still did have shortages here. And
yeah, and I think
so
one really interesting thing that's happening that I've tried to think through is one place that this is showing up more and more, and I think that the incentives get really complicated here, is that Amazon, for example, implemented its own price gouging policy.
Okay.
And said, like, you can't price gouge on our website. And I think eBay did the same thing. Is that true, Rick? Do you remember? And so that will actually have similar impacts. So maybe some of it is driven by that. I think also something that happens, and this reminds me of doing bad by doing good, although that's about a totally different issue, is I can imagine grocery stores. No, I don't want to increase prices because, I mean, just think about the incentives of a grocery store. Like grocery stores definitely think about long-term. The grocery store wants you to say, that's the grocery store I go to.
Right.
The grocery store is not going to be like, oh, I'm going to get 30 cents extra for this one roll of toilet paper from this guy this one day.
Right.
Like they're going to be thinking about you coming back for the next 5 years. So it's an interesting case there because it's like you're actually, it's a doing bad by doing good situation. Right. And everybody, but if they allow the price to rate, they're probably right that they'll annoy their customers. My favorite example is from Denmark. And what they did is they said, you can still buy one bottle of hand sanitizer at the pre-COVID price, like $5 or whatever it was. But the second, or it was kroner because it was in Denmark. The second one was like 50 times more expensive.
Oh, wow.
And so that was like I thought that was a cool and creative way of saying, hey, scarcity, you should only buy one. But it also allowed you to buy two, like if you're that person that really has that demand. Another thing that stores did in the US, especially because notice that stores in a price gouging state would not have been allowed to do that. So some stores just said you're only allowed to buy. And I saw that in grocery stores in Utah. Like, due to these conditions, you can only buy one of these goods.
Right.
And so that's actually cool to me because that is economic agents adapting to the rules of the game. Like, right, like we have to adapt to the scarcity. We're going to adapt to scarcity because that's what we do. We can't do it with prices because there's a law. And it's just really taking a tool out of the toolkit in some sense of economic agents whose actions, if we have kind of our key components of markets like private property markets, their actions will take care of the scarcity. Will reflect the scarcity in the market, right? And there's a lot of different tools that might allow it to reflect that scarcity. For example, going to 8 different grocery stores to find toilet paper is a reflection of the scarcity of toilet paper, right? Like that is the price you're paying. It's just in miles driven in time and gasoline instead of being in dollars for toilet paper.
Yeah. No, that's good. And it's what makes economics kind of muddy, but it also uh, is job security, because you can just like go at it by with a different angle, right? You have 3 papers now,
Oh
maybe
yeah,
4 or
absolutely.
5. There's going to be so many derivatives that can come out of this natural experiment that and the last week we had Dr. Will Luther come in talking about kind of PPE and
Yeah.
that same issue, right? And